Hey, this is Suzi Marsh Meffen, and it's a couple of days before Christmas, and supposedly one of the very, very coldest times in decades. I happen to be at my daughter Cindel's house, and it's freezing here, and it's wonderful. I wanted to talk about grief today because I'm actually in a wonderful place and I've had a lot of loss in my life and have dealt with a lot of grief personally and professionally with other people and helping people come to terms with loss. So I'm hoping that this is recording loud enough. There is the stereotypical sort of steps to grief, but I had training years and years ago on something that I thought was even more helpful, and that is the phases that we go through when we're grieving actually go in sort of a circular motion. So instead of steps that go up and down, we sort of come through the same phases sort of over and over again. And eventually, of course, I know a lot of people don't believe this, but I do believe that there is somewhat of a resolution to most losses, even very tragic, terrible losses. So the first stage is denial. So, of course, when something horrible happens, even something trivial like hitting my car. I love my car, so that's my dog. When I've hit it before, my first thought is that I did not hit it. So when something terrible happens, like a death, especially of a close family member, the first thing is shock and denial. And that's like thinking you're going to see that person or expecting them to walk in the room. Just sort of the part of our brain that is trying to sort of lighten the awareness and make it come to us very slowly. There is, of course, the pathological avoidance of that loss and of that grief. And the beginning stage is not pathological. It is just the brain trying to slowly get us used to the event, the loss, the tragedy. So there's a book called Necessary Losses, and I really like that because she talks about things that are necessary to grieve, but they may not be a death. Like when we moved from Atlanta to Melbourne, Florida, that was a huge loss. Lost our support system, my family members that were in Atlanta, lost our home, lost the city, the familiarity, everything changes. So those are some necessary losses when you move. When you're growing up, you sort of change identity, and that's a necessary loss. And as you move through stages of development, those of us that did not come from very attached family, bonded family, then sometimes we miss out on some of those stages. So there are things and changes that we go through that take us through very similar phases of grieving. So the first one again is sort of shock and denial. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we don't really go through this in steps. We sort of come by the stages in a circular sort of area, motion rather. So one of the next stages is bargaining. And that's when, like hitting my car, it's like, okay, maybe it's not that bad. Or maybe they're just really, really, really sick, or it just didn't really happen the way I've been told it happened, or somehow bargaining. And again, it's the brain trying to prevent us from having to go through the final stages. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So denial, bargaining, the shock. Unfortunately, one of the stages is blame. I remember my brother was killed by a drunk driver in 1979, And I remember my mother blaming my father, and I was bonded to her in a very sick sort of bond. And so then I blamed my father, and I was the family scapegoat. So I would always say what no one would say and what everybody might be thinking. And I remember telling my dad it was his fault and my brother died. Oh, it was horrible, horrible. Luckily, we came to great terms before my parents died. Things got much, much better. But the stage of blame, I've noticed, is again another way to keep the pain of the loss at bay. But it can become very pathological. And I know for me, it was a real sick dynamic in my family. Blaming each other. And I've never worked with somebody or a family that didn't, at the bottom line, after they finished blaming other people, then blamed themselves. When my brother died, the night that he died, he came up to me and he said, I need a ride to the store. My brother was really sick, and I need a ride to the store. And I said, I can't, unfortunately. I was going out partying that night. And I said, I can't give you a ride. And he said, I just need to get some cigarettes. And I said, I can't, I'm busy. And years later, it turns out that not only did he ask me for a ride, but he asked a couple of my other siblings, which was a great, strange, horrible relief because as one of my therapists back then said to me, oh, you're a murderer. It was a horrible, wonderful moment when she said that, because deep down, and this has happened with everyone I've ever worked with, deep down, we emotionally blame ourselves after we stop blaming everybody else, the guy that was driving drunk, blah, 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 all those really good reasons to blame other people. And that is an important stage in grief. When I lost a client once to suicide and I was trying to journal about it, I made myself say, it's my fault, it's my fault. I knew that this was a stage, but I wanted to really embrace it and get it out. It was horrifying to my husband that I was doing this, by the way, but it was really helpful and important to me. And I wrote it over and over and over and over and over. At a later stage, I ripped up all those pieces as part of the healing of that stage. So everybody deals with it in their own way. And again, when I think of pathological grieving, it's when we get stuck at one stage. And I'm pretty sure my whole family got stuck at a couple of different stages. And it takes not days to go through each phase of grief. In some cases, each stage lasts years. The closer and the deeper the relationship with that person, the longer those stages last, because it's trying to put off that final stage of deep grief. So bargaining, blaming, self-blame. I've seen some wonderful movies where they try to get the protagonist to really see how it's not possible for it to be their fault. And it was the first time I saw that, it was actually wonderful. I ended up really weeping and weeping, partly out of relief and joy. And when that therapist said to me, so you're a murderer, I said it was wonderful and terrible, because deep down, she knew exactly what she was doing, but I felt it. And like I said, I felt terrible relief, but also a positive sense of relief. So eventually, there's all sorts of tricks and defenses the brain uses to prevent us from getting to the deeper stage. And the deeper stage is the weeping and the grieving and the crying. I haven't mentioned the anger. Anger comes, for me, anger came closer to the end, and I would have to say rage. Rage also was a helpful stage to get that kind of anger out. As a therapist, I believe very much in anger and rage work when it's appropriate, when the person is the right candidate. My brother was killed by a drunk driver, so I had to do a lot of grief work around that. And then in 2012 or 13, we moved from Atlanta. My best friend died of lung cancer. My sponsor, my mentor, died after her daughter died of lung cancer. And so that was 3 deaths. And there was something else, I think a pet died. But then my client suicided, and that created an absolutely horrible, horrible depression in me. So I decided to do what I remembered from working in a treatment center and how they used to do work with the teenagers around loss and other things. So anger was a really important part of my recovery process way before I had any of those losses. I believe as a therapist in doing anger work, anger and rage reduction. Rage work when you're doing shame reduction, because shame is a part of the process of grieving. After you blame everyone else, and I remember the blame in my family and it was horrible, then many times you blame yourself. So blame is another way to say, self-blame is another way to say shame. Shame means it's my fault. I caused it. Now, my brother wanted me to take him to the store to get cigarettes, so it was very easy for me to blame myself. And I think I mentioned a therapist called me a murderer as not tongue-in-cheek, but to sort of hit me over the head with the reality that I did feel like a murderer. And it was a wonderful way for me to face it, and I appreciated it. Some people think it's harsh, but it was perfect for me. So facing that and the shame, and then everybody in my family he'd asked for a ride. So basically all of us killed him, really. And basically the drunk driver killed him. And no, I don't really get into forgiveness. I let God do the forgiving. And yes, I work on that. I'm not there yet, but maybe one day. So that feeling of it's my fault, it's your fault, it's his fault, it's her fault is a stage. And like all of these phases that we go through sort of circularly, we go by denial, go back into believing it happened, then we go into blame, then we go back into denial. So you touch on all of the phases at different times, more like in a spiral, moving closer and closer and closer to acceptance. So relieving self of it's my fault is really, really a difficult stage. Now, each of these phases may take a couple of months to a number of years, especially if we're talking about a tragic death, a horrible death, an untimely death, a death of someone you're really close to. Then it's even worse. So for me, going through those phases and going through those stages after we moved here, again, having to face all that grief again, it was amazing. And I do remember for a long time not being able to cry. That didn't come for quite a while for me. Sometimes people get suicidal during severe grief. When we had all those losses at once and then the suicide of my client, I definitely went through a horrible depression and thought of suicide. Thank God I had such a strong relationship with my higher power, who I call God, that I knew I couldn't do that and that God would not give me permission. And more than anything, my family, my husband and his children, um, that was my sisters. It was horrible. I knew no matter how much I fantasized it that I could not do it. And fantasizing it, I never experienced that. I heard about it as a therapist from many clients that they would fantasize suicide, and I thought it was terrible. But then I understood when it happened to me, it was a relief. It was a sick fantasy, but it gave a relief that was strange. I would analyze myself as I was going through this process because it was interesting and fascinating in a sick kind of way. But the final stage for me was to make meaning out of the loss. And I chose to do Day of the Dead paper dolls on everyone that I lost. So everyone, and my mother and I used to make paper dolls together. So it was a really honoring of my mother also. So when I made each paper doll, I really enjoyed it, and I dressed them and surrounded them with icons of their achievements and things that they loved. And my friend Linda, my best friend at that time, um, died from lung cancer from nicotine. So I had her with a tennis racket and all the students. We worked at a school together, our school, and all the students that loved her. And then my sponsor, my mentor, I had people all over her clothes, just all the people I imagined that she helped, and her family. And so for each person, and I think I had some pets, I did a paper doll and dressed them up, and every day couldn't wait to come home and finish this project. I just really craved doing it. It was a wonderful way for me to get through that depression and that grief. And those paper dolls were a real physical example of how I honored them, and each of their icons surrounded them. And it was a wonderful way for me to move past the deep crying and weeping stage, the very final stage that your brain is really trying to prevent you from going through, which is that deep, deep grief and weeping, and such an incredibly painful part of life. So getting to the creating something out of it, creating something from each of those losses was a really enjoyable, creative, and fun process. And each time I did, I felt like I was honoring them because my grief had been so big. So that's what I hope you get from this, is getting to the place after the grieving where you can make something physical, make something psychological. And for me, it was also spiritual to make those paper dolls. So don't rush through the stages, as horrible as they are. Let them happen. Trust your intuition. Know that relying on your higher power, that it is going to help you with the pain and eventually to make meaning from it. All right, thanks. Good luck. And my favorite book is How to Survive the Loss of a Love, and it's just a really short little paperback. How to Survive the Loss of a Love, and I can't remember the author, sorry. Anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.